Welcome to Lesson 4 of Section 6 of the BJCP Training Program from the Brewers Anonymous Homebrew Club. We're continuing looking at the brewing process, and now we're on to the roughly subcategorized fermentation steps. So, we have gotten our wort to the point that it's at temperature that our yeast will thrive, be healthy and happy, and we will get the fermentation started and let those yeasts turn that wort into beer. And the first thing we need to do is transfer that wort into a fermentation vessel. After this, there's another thing we want to do to the wort to make this environment even better for the yeast to thrive and give us our desired fermentation, and that's oxygenate the beer. This is typically done one of two ways on the commercial level, either adding oxygen directly through a diffusion stone or pumping filtered air through a diffusion stone. Obviously, using oxygen is more efficient and will require less aeration time in the wort, but the filtered air will add the desired oxygen eventually as well. So, all right, we have got our wort in the fermenter. We've aerated the wort to add oxygen. Finally, we can pitch the yeast. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to yeast, what it does, how it does it, what different strains add, how controlling its environment gives us some interesting and specific results. And we'll get more into those types of details when we cover yeast in the ingredients section of this course. But for this lesson and this section, in its most basic terms, the yeast is now consuming the sugars in the wort and expelling ethanol and CO2 as a byproduct and making our beer. There's several types of fermentation vessels. The most common ones you're going to see in local breweries are the tall, conical-shaped fermenters. These are usually jacketed with lines for coolant like glycol that can be run through and maintain the desired temperatures for the yeast being used. But along with these fermenters, you might see from time to time some wooden vats or foeders, barrels, clay amphoras. These are more specialized vessels used for specific purposes in regards to unique flavors, aromas, and mouthfeels that they contribute. But for our purposes, when we talk about fermentation and fermenters, we're referring to the closed, temperature-controlled vessels in this course. None of these specialized fermenters. I just kind of wanted to point them out to explain what they are if you've seen them in your local breweries. Once the fermentation is complete, we need to get it off the yeast. And depending on what we want to do with the beer post-fermentation, we'll decide what's next. One thing we may do is just drop the yeast out of the bottom of the fermenter and leave the beer in the fermenter for a short period of time before we go on to the next step in the process. For longer conditioning periods or traditional lager time, we might transfer to a lager tank and let those common, stronger lager yeast fermentation characters mellow out a bit and smooth out the beer. Barrels might be the next destination for the beer if that's going to be a barrel-aged beer. It could be moved to a cask if it's intended to be a cask-conditioned beer. Like most of the steps in this whole process, there's several things that can happen in this phase, but again, for the purpose of this program and these exams, we're going to move on with the common process of dropping the yeast from the fermenter and then going to the next step with our beer. So, even though we've moved the beer off the yeast, chances are it still may not be as clear as we like or clear enough to the style that we've intended to brew. If that's the case, we want to do a filter or fining step on our beer. And as with just about every other step in this phase, there's a couple of ways to approach this. The first is to physically filter the beer. Commonly for a physically filtered beer, the beer is run through a filtration system in a form of series of filters and plates to physically clear the beer. A less direct and less labor-intensive option is fining with a post-fermentation fining agent. This is where you add a fining agent such as a liquid colloidal solution of silicic acid that attracts the particles in the beer that cause a cloudy and hazy appearance and drops them to the bottom of the aging vessel. Then the beer is separated from that sediment, much like removing it from the yeast. Or another option is just let it sit. Like the phrase, time heals all wounds, time clears most beers, eventually. So now, at this point of the process, we are really close to enjoying our beer, but there's one more phase left, and that's where we are discussing in the next lesson. So I will see you there.